Chapter 8. Romanticism. The Enlightenment's reframing of nature as a thing to be conformed to man's needs and desires exposed human nature to a metamorphosis in Romanticism. Man's universal nature was denied. In its place, poets and philosophers imputed to man a nature which is both historically contingent and particular to each individual. It was claimed that every time and place has its peculiar way of being human, within which the individual expresses his own unique nature peculiar to himself. The natural law by which every human conscience is bound was relativized and subjectified. The commandments were replaced by an ethic of authenticity, which gave new meaning to Polonius's platitude, "To thine own self be true." By repudiating man's universal nature, the Romantic rejected the target at which human nature aims to become the author of his own ends. He revolted against the law inscribed within him to follow another law of his own creation, with foreseeable consequences for the fine arts. It cannot be denied that Romanticism produced masterpieces. In music, in poetry, and in painting, Romanticism inspired redoubtable works of art, since its principles motivated artists to be inventive, but those same principles ultimately led to the rejection of every rule of art in denial of art's nature and purpose. Before the Romantic movement, art was not made of an artist's warts. As a beautiful imitation of nature, fine art was defined less by the idiosyncrasies of an artist's style than by its timeless universality. The work of art expressed eternal verities, transcending the hand that made it. The Romantics turned art into mere self-expression. The first philosopher to make self-expression the purpose of art was the late 18th century German idealist Johann Gottfried von Herder. He believed that man's power of self-expression is the essence of human nature, a power which is based upon language and begins with the poetic arts. According to Herder, poetry is an expression not of a timeless and universal beauty or truth, but of someone. It is the voice of one human being addressing another, and therefore expresses the particular attitude toward life of its maker, as constituted by his society. When a man wishes to express himself, he uses words which he does not invent. The means of expression which make him fully human are received through his cultural inheritance, an identity which he shares in common with others proximate to him. Hence, a work of art brings one into contact with a whole society as well as an individual. A sculpture by Phidias, for example, is only properly understood in terms of its culturally contingent purposes, as an expression of Athenian democracy in the 5th century BC. To appreciate any work of classical art fully, it must be analyzed in terms of the ancient people to whom it was addressed. One must enter vicariously into the world of ancient Greece as a way of life. Herder believed that every culture has its own way of being, which is valid for a particular time and place and can be appreciated even by those who do not share it. There is not just one true way of being human, let alone of making art. There are, on the contrary, many ways. Another German idealist, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, elaborated upon Herder's doctrine of art as self-expression. Art, Fichte claimed, is a means of lifting the self out of its natural oblivion into consciousness by the mastery of opposition, beginning with the resistance of the materials on which the artist imposes his will. The self which the artist would express is not an object of introspection, but the nominative self, the I as opposed to the me. Of this self, asserted Fichte, one cannot become aware in a mere act of cognition, but only upon encountering resistance to it. Fichte regarded this resistance as the fundamental category which characterizes all experience, and even as the foundation of ontology, since it proves that solipsism is false. There is a reality outside oneself, impeding one's desires and dividing being between the self and the not-self. From the dialectical conflict between the self and everything external to it, reality is brought to appearance. Fine art expresses an ontological truth simply by displaying the heroic struggle of the will against all that opposes it. Friedrich Schelling enlarged upon Fichte's preoccupation with the will by interpreting the human will as the supreme expression of a vitalism immanent everywhere in nature, a blind, mysterious spirit which asserts itself in the titanic struggle of history. This Geist commences in brute unconsciousness by striving after it knows not what, and progressively comes to consciousness of itself. By becoming aware of what he is striving for, man brings the whole universe to consciousness of itself. The artist's goal is to bring to light the dark, unconscious forces which move him by means of the most agonizing struggle. Fichte and Schelling understood this creative struggle as inimical to the rules of art and the imitation of masters. Quote, all those who have resigned themselves to represent only the derivative, the second-hand product, Fichte characterized as a mere annex to life. Not for them those pure springs which flowed before them and which still may be flowing around them. They are but an echo coming from a distant rock, from a voice which is now silent. End quote. According to Schelling, the only works of art that have any value at all are those which convey the pulsations of a not yet fully conscious vitality bursting forth, while any work of art which is fully self-conscious as a product of codified rules may be elegant and symmetrical, but it is also dead. He echoed Immanuel Kant's belief that fine art must be a product of genius and cannot be judged by its adherence to rules. Among German idealists, Kant at least had enough in common with Plato and Aristotle to regard man as a rational being subject to universal moral imperatives. The autonomy which Kant so highly prized was the freedom to act rationally, as opposed to the bondage of brute impulse and blind obedience to authority. The Romantics adopted the ideal of Kantian autonomy and transformed it into something else altogether. For the Romantic playwright Friedrich Schiller, the Kantian subject restrained by universal laws was like a bird unable to take flight, tethered to a string. The Kantian subject is not a true philosopher-citizen of the Greek polis, Schiller objected, but a barbarian who makes a fetish of his moral code. Beyond the savage enslaved to his brute passions and the barbarian enslaved to codified rules, the Romantic distinguished another type of man who invents his own values and commits himself to them in heroic defiance, if necessary, of human nature and of reason. The means of this liberation, according to Schiller, is fine art, which as a form of play converts the necessity of following rules into a free, harmonious, and spontaneous action. Artists are properly self-governing because they obey rules of their own making. The idea which an artist imprints on matter is not discovered by scientific means or by reading sacred texts, but is a product of the artist's genius. By overcoming the resistance of his materials and obliging nature to follow his ideal in a beautiful and harmonious manner, the artist shows what it means to be human by rising above nature and molding her and crushing her and finally subjugating her to his unfettered will. The liberation of man by the subjugation of nature having always been the objective of the Enlightenment, Romanticism did not so much oppose the Enlightenment as complete it, in this regard at least. The roots of Romanticism can be traced back to the Scottish Enlightenment and its philosophy of moral sentiment, which arose in reaction to John Locke's divine command theory of morality. The idea that morality consists of a list of arbitrary rules sanctioned by the divine will and enforced by commensurable rewards and punishments in the afterlife struck Francis Hutcheson as a bloodless ethic, because the preoccupation with cold objectivity gave no place to the human heart. Hutcheson proposed instead that God had implanted in human beings moral sentiments, the purpose of one's emotional life being to provide guidance as to what one should or should not do. According to Hutcheson, being moral is less a matter of rational deliberation than of following the voice of moral sentiment. This idea was picked up and augmented by Jean-Jacques Rousseau as the voice of nature within. The danger we face in our moral lives, according to Rousseau, is that this voice will be drowned out by the demands of society. For fear of what others may think, one ceases to rely on the voice within and begins to rely instead on the opinions of others, so much as to lose touch with one's own sense of reality, which Rousseau called le sentiment de l'existence. Beginning with Rousseau's novel Émile, this idea became a literary trope of the 18th and 19th century Bildungsroman. Two familiar examples include Huckleberry Finn's misplaced compunction over aiding and abetting a runaway slave, and Catherine Earnshaw's rejection of Heathcliff due to his social status in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Rousseau's voice of nature within was construed by Immanuel Kant as the universal voice of rational autonomy, but Herder took it as the basis of a more individualistic ethic. This voice, declared Herder, is not the general voice of morality, but one which reveals a way of being human which is entirely one's own. Everyone is called to lead a life peculiar to oneself, echoed Fichte and Schelling. Søren Kierkegaard said it best, truth is subjectivity. From the Reformation to the Enlightenment and Romanticism, modernity has been a project of deracination. All our traditions and inherited customs, all the techniques of artistic and intellectual genius, and even the natural sensitivity to beauty, have been uprooted, on the premise that once unburdened by these things, we would at last be free to author ourselves. To define one's own identity rather than inherit the identity of one's father, a man must become fatherless. Hence, the romantic hero in 19th century literature is so often an orphan. Be it Pip from Great Expectations, Oliver Twist, Jane Eyre, Heathcliff, or Huckleberry Finn, it is an orphan, the least and most vulnerable member of mankind, who alone has the independence to become the greatest, a self-creating supreme being in the flesh, a god among men like Oedipus the king. Of course, we know from the Oedipus trilogy what happens to a man who murders his own father. At the end of the project of emancipation from tradition, we have discovered that we are not free, but hapless, tormented, and confused. As compelling as the portrayal of self-authored men and women in the works of romantic literature may be, one has only to look around to discover that the actual condition of the modern, autonomous individual is much worse than Charles Dickens ever imagined. For the autonomous subject is no orphan like Oliver Twist, but a child of the devil. He is a slave to the worst of masters. The only way out of this vile servitude is to use modernity's project of emancipation to author ourselves back into tradition. The romantic heroes of literature are so compelling because they tell a true story. As children of the devil, born in original sin, we really do have to become orphans in order to become adopted sons of God. We have to seize our independence from the tyranny that oppresses us in order to surrender it to the legitimate authority of our ancestral traditions, just as St. Francis had to renounce his father and patrimony to become the man he was destined to be. This is what I have done and continue to do. The ethic of authenticity having played a decisive role in my own development as an artist, the best critique I can offer of this ethic of Romanticism is ironically to describe my own experience of having successfully put it into practice. Growing up in the 1990s, when postmodern irony ruled the day, I possessed a romantic spirit of gravity out of step with the times. I was a very serious child, and I took everything very seriously, including art, which I could not possibly enjoy with an air of nonchalance or disinterestedness. I despised Manet and the Impressionists, and I even disliked the art of Eugène Delacroix, the romantic painter par excellence. I can remember walking through the Louvre for the very first time as a teenager and thinking to myself as I scrutinized Delacroix's The Death of Sardanapalus with indignation, that's where it all went wrong. Ingres himself could hardly have judged Delacroix's art more censoriously than I did. On the other hand, I was not unmoved by Théodore Géricault, but found myself as captivated as anyone by the Raft of the Medusa, which the French reflexively misattribute to Delacroix. I was a romantic at heart. I fondly remember being carried away by the English romantic poets and by all the Byronic heroes of so many 19th century novels, deeply solitary, mournful, passionate, and vengeful men, in whom I saw an aggrandized picture of myself. Of the mostly classical music on which I was raised, I preferred Beethoven, particularly on the piano, because no matter how badly I played, the passionate intensity of his sonatas made up for my technical ineptitude. The strife of Romanticism resonated wonderfully with the interior life of an adolescent. The only reason that I did not respond positively to Delacroix as I did to Géricault is that I disliked sloppy drawing. I gave no thought to philosophy or to what Romanticism stood for. I didn't know anything, nor did I think it necessary to, when the greatness of a great work of art is something you can see with your eyes and feel in your bones. It is just obvious. It does not need to be theorized, as theory adds nothing to, and can subtract nothing from, a great work of art. So I firmly believed. For this reason, I sought no basis in reason or in any external authority for my aesthetic judgment, and after reading Immanuel Kant, I was pleased to find this attitude confirmed by the highest philosophical authority. Considering what I had already encountered in modern art museums, I was entirely skeptical of received opinion, and I was convinced that the whole society around me was conspiring to corrupt my authentic sense of reality. I saw how others allowed their judgment to be swayed by common opinion, and I was not going to allow that to happen to me. I was determined to be true to myself, to believe the evidence of my own eyes and the promptings of my heart. I made my emotions my guide, not only with respect to art, but even in matters of morality and faith as well. Moral sentiment told me what I should and should not do, which seemed to suffice because I had very strong moral sentiments. I had no inkling of how this could lead me astray. Everything I absorbed from the novels I read and from the films I watched confirmed my intuitive approach to life. I imbibed Romanticism in the water that I drank and inhaled it in the air that I breathed. Indeed, I was shaped by all of the errors of the modern world. I was raised a Protestant, and I studied Enlightenment philosophy, and I lived altogether unreflectively on the maxims of Romanticism. Just like the blind, unconscious will of Hegelian Geist, which strives after it knows not what and slowly resolves the contradictions within itself by means of the most agonizing struggle, I too was blind and did not know what I was striving after. There were contradictions in my way of thinking which I was unconsciously driven to sort out. The rebellious, revolutionary ethos of Romanticism played its part in this by motivating me to rebel against the modern and postmodern art world. The most critical step along the revolutionary orbit, which eventually brought me back to the origin and resolved the conflicts and oppositions in my thinking, was to fix my sights on the kind of art that I was going to make. By the time I finished art school, I had no doubt about what I wanted to do. I was determined to become a classical history painter. I was going to paint classical myths and biblical stories just like the old masters, and I was not going to make one single concession to contemporary tastes or prejudices. I could not explain the urgent necessity of this project at the time, but I saw the necessity of it as clear as day. It was an inspiration from which I could not turn aside. My artistic practice came first, guided by a clear intuition, and my understanding followed. In time, all of the errors of Romanticism which I had imbibed as an adolescent were replaced by a more mature and harmonious view of reality, corresponding to the kind of art that I make, as beauty led me to the truth, even the truth of Catholicism. My desire to become a classical history painter was not unrelated to an ideal of romantic heroism. I knew that there were no accolades to be won, and that there was no money to be made by following this path, which is no doubt why it appealed to me. I suppose I wanted to be a martyr for a worthy cause, like the stereotypical starving artist living in a garret and scorned by the world. The romantic hero is a Christ-like figure who lays down his life with total disregard for the golden mean in an excess of passion. I wanted something beautiful to commit myself to, wholly and unreservedly, and I also wanted to suffer meritoriously for it. Yet, I also distrusted any ideal embodied in artists like Vincent van Gogh or Paul Gauguin, men in whom I found absolutely nothing to admire. Especially after taking a seminar on Immanuel Kant, I thought of myself and of my art as being allied with the Enlightenment, and under the banners of aestheticism and classicism, I was determined to oppose the decadence of Romanticism and its offshoots. I was not alone in thinking this way, as the mentality of the Atelier movement is understandably in the spirit of the Enlightenment. In the 20th century, the modern art world exerted even more pressure to conform than there had ever been in the salons of the 19th century, the only difference being that the manly competence which had previously been rewarded began to be severely punished. The few classical painters who persevered were compelled to play the Enlightenment rationalist, as the conservative foil to the progress of the avant-garde. The classical painter was obliged to exercise Kantian maturity by thinking for himself, to become a Cartesian skeptic by doubting everything he was told, and also an empiricist like David Hume by trusting only his own eyes. Authenticity having never been more endangered by the corrupting voice of society, classical painters lived out the ethic of Romanticism by fleeing Romanticism in their own art. The ateliers founded by these incorrigibly classical artists have naturally been keen to emphasize the disinterested objectivity of their empirical methods and the scientific precision of their process, which I relished. Like other students of the atelier movement, I was very much drawn to the aestheticizing art of the late 19th century academics such as Frederick Leighton and William Bouguereau, and I was happy to endure the tedium of making master copies and cast drawings because I knew that if I was going to paint like an academician, I needed academic instruction. Unlike a romantic who need no more learn how to paint than learn how to love, but only to be carried away on the wings of emotion. The romantic follows the voice of nature where'er the winds may blow, and he comes to an exquisitely tragic end, as in Johann von Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, published in 1774, the first romantic novel. Young Werther's love affair ends in suicide rather than marriage because he does not abide by the rules but allows himself to fall in love with a married woman. He is a law unto himself, which is a perilous condition, since his interior law does not conform with right reason. His tragic flaw is that he does not think, as he mistakes his unreflective self for his authentic self. Werther acts without apprehending his true end, and so he becomes passionately committed to an end which does not merit his commitment. Werther is moved by evil under the aspect of the good, by the beauty of a young married woman, for to be only partly good is to be evil, and to be only partly true is to be false, since the good is integrally so, while evil derives from any defect whatsoever. Given that the passions can always be moved by the defective goodness of things that are evil, art and morality and religion are bound to become unmoored by making sentimentality the basis of doctrinal, moral, and aesthetic judgment. After I had been hard at work for several years without much to show for it, I never doubted that my artistic goals merited my commitment, though I did doubt my ability. And like Werther, I was tempted by feelings of resentment, because society presented no viable path for pursuing a career as a classical history painter. Unable to possess the woman he desires, Werther concludes that the problem is not with him, but with society, which is incapable of recognizing the superiority of his morality. Werther is not allowed to express himself against the opposition of the Philistine society in which he lives. Goethe presents Werther as a tragic figure who suffers heroically for his freely chosen ideals. Goethe would have one believe that Werther is a free spirit enthralled neither to base passions nor to a rationalistic moral code, but this is misleading. Werther is a man in bondage to his passions, and above all to his pride. So was I, perhaps, although in contrast to Werther's opposition to legitimate norms concerning adultery, I was surely right to oppose the Philistinism of the society in which I live. The Romantics fetishize the tragic heroism of martyrdom, quite irrespective of the cause for which one dies, because the passionate commitment to an ideal was paramount. Any ideal would do so long as it was sincerely felt. I never quite believed this. I was sure that there must be a difference between a true ideal and a false one, though I trusted that whatever could move me was genuinely good. I simply couldn't imagine that modern artists could have acted in all sincerity. I smelled a whiff of Duchamp's sarcasm, even in the most spiritually pretentious works of abstraction, because I could not conceive of anything so preposterous being sincerely felt. In retrospect, I should have had more imagination. My commitment to Protestant Christianity inhibited me from becoming a relativizing historicist in the mold of Herder and Hegel, though historicism was a temptation for me. I was always drawn to the diverse polytheistic worlds of antiquity, so much so that when I went to college I majored in Egyptology. The allure of Egypt for me had a great deal to do with its art and architecture, though it was not only the art which fascinated me, but the world which it placed before my eyes. Unlike the art of classical Greece and Rome, which has a deceptively familiar look to it, the art of ancient Egypt opens onto a truly foreign country. To enter into the mind of Egypt was the ultimate flight of the imagination for me, and one which I relished immensely. My natural point of entry as a child was the point of intersection between Egypt and Israel. The fact that Egypt is not represented in the most positive light in the Bible was a source of cognitive dissonance for me, because the beauty of Egypt's temples, tombs, and statues was to me evidence of its goodness. Into Egypt's irrational myths and magical thinking, I projected bottomless profundity, all the wisdom of the Egyptians, in which Moses himself was initiated. I could scarcely bring myself to connect Egyptian idolatry with the demonic. I was inclined to regard Egyptian idolatry as a form of natural religion, whose errors were excusable absent divine revelation. I never doubted the merits of Egyptian art and architecture, formulaic as it is, nor did I doubt that there was something genuinely good in what it represented. False beliefs can be sincerely appreciated by those who do not hold them, especially insofar as they take a poetic form which can be creatively and generously misinterpreted. Were ancient Egyptian paganism reduced to an abstract philosophical discourse, amounting to a list of theological propositions which are simply untrue, it would have lost all its appeal for me. After my initial dalliance with Immanuel Kant, accompanied by a good dose of existentialist philosophy and novels by Fyodor Dostoevsky while in college, I began to study Martin Heidegger, whose Being and Time prompted a significant shift in my thinking. Heidegger's critique of ontotheology and breathless anticipation of the return of art were a revelation to me. He obliged me to reconsider my opinion of the Enlightenment and Romanticism, as well as Protestantism. Heidegger's philosophy has been described plausibly as Catholic theology shorn of theistic content. Having begun his education with the intention of becoming a Jesuit theologian before abandoning the study of theology for philosophy, he never entirely shed the husk of his Catholic faith. Following the phenomenological method of his mentor Edmund Husserl, Heidegger pursued an indirect approach to metaphysics by bracketing out everything susceptible of skepticism to focus on the indubitable content of consciousness. Heidegger's ontology is not a formal definition of being, but a description of the intentional content of the mind, on the reasonable premise that what one knows of the nature of being is found in the experience of being human. Since human existence is embedded in a world constituted by language and custom, the experience of being human is variable from one culture to the next, which observation led Heidegger to follow in the relativizing footsteps of Herder and Hegel. While Heidegger does speak of the world in being and time, as if there were only one, in later writings, he became preoccupied, like other philosophers of that time, with problems of language and with how our experience of being has changed from one era to the next. He concluded that being and time describes an experience specific to the post-Enlightenment and post-Christian West. At first, I did not notice the relativistic drift of Heidegger's philosophy, since he never admits to it frankly, but I did recognize the resonance with Christianity. Over his own objections, to say nothing of his disdain for Jean-Paul Sartre, Heidegger has been classed among the existentialists, the heirs of Romanticism, who believed that man's existence precedes his essence, which he determines for himself by what he does. As a post-Christian philosophy, existentialism has its variants of original sin. Heidegger described the human condition as verfallen, because there is obviously something wrong with man and the world into which he is thrown. He is not whole, but abandoned to frenzied objectification and distraction. Man is not at home in the world, a fact which our civilization has aspired to correct by technological means only to exacerbate it. Yet, as soon as man gives thought to his homelessness, reflects Heidegger, it is a misery no longer. Rightly considered and kept well in mind, it is the sole summons that calls mortals into their dwelling. Born into exile, a man makes his way home by surrendering his attachments to beings, and instead following being. Sell all that thou hast, as Christ said, and come, follow me. The authentic self is a reflective self, which does not flee the condition of existence but confronts it head-on. Real freedom has to be won in a fully conscious confrontation with the facts of human existence. First and foremost, the fact that life is temporal. To a Catholic, this means detaching oneself from the futile desire to find fulfillment in the things of this world and living always in view of death and judgment. What Heidegger meant is to detach oneself from the hope of ultimate fulfillment as such, and to live in recognition of the fact that one's life will come to nothing. The conscious awareness of life's temporality makes it all the more urgent for a Catholic to make the best use of life, in recognition of the fact that there is only so much time to secure one's eternal beatitude. Heidegger believed that there is a similar urgency which arises from confronting the fact that there is no eternal beatitude, as illustrated by the gravity of Achilles in Homer's Iliad, who, unlike the deathless gods, takes life very seriously. Authenticity is the opposite of nonchalance. It is entirely opposed to the detachment of the modern and postmodern subject, who stands apart from the world and gazes on it. To be, according to Heidegger, is to care, and the structure of care is temporality. Upon confronting the facts of existence, Dasein, the conscious agent projects himself into the future, causing worry, and then into the past, causing shame. The uncomfortable reality of human existence is that we are not what we could and should be. To confront Dasein is to discover possibilities for being which have not been fully realized. What these possibilities are is constrained by the world into which one is thrown. A Catholic world presents the possibility of becoming a saint and calls on everyone to do so. Facing the fires of hell or of purgatory, to say nothing of offending God who is all good and deserving of all one's love, the Catholic has a tremendous motivation for fear and for love of God to rectify his defects by cooperating with God's grace. And yet even those Catholics who refuse the call to holiness do so in a Catholic way, since one can only do what one does in the world. Dasein is being in the world. Even from a Catholic perspective, man is the author of himself, insofar as he must choose between good and evil. While this is true irrespective of culture, the time and place in which one's existence inheres gives scope to this moral agency by defining a range of potential. Christendom opened up one set of possibilities. The pagan world of antiquity opened up another. Heidegger found both superior to the destitution of the modern world. Heidegger's anticipation of the return of art to address the destitution of the age recalled the reaction of Romantics against the Enlightenment. Facing the displacement of art and religion by science and technology in the 19th century, the Romantics had attempted to make art into an ersatz religion, and the artist into a priest, prophet, and king, another messiah and a creator of new worlds, who is moved not but moves. Art was to be the Romantics' ground of being, absent a transcendent God. Hence, in A Defense of Poetry, Percy Bysshe Shelley made poets such as himself out to be the unacknowledged legislators of the world, and Friedrich Nietzsche went further still, conceiving of the tragic poet as a superman who alone would save society from the devaluation of Christian values by inventing a new definition of being and a new conception of the good at which to aim. He would not despair of life or descend into aimlessness, but create his own values out of nothing and commit himself to them with all the zeal of the martyrs. The poet's genius was to be the baptismal fount from which a new type of man would be born, a false hope to which Martin Heidegger was not immune. His sympathy for National Socialism, of which he never publicly repented, was related to a romantic expectation that modern man might transcend the demise of Christianity and set up a heroic neo-pagan world, though there are moments in Heidegger's writing which instead anticipate a revitalization of Catholicism, cognizant as he was of the failure of Romanticism's religion of high culture and of the flaws in Nietzsche's tragic heroism. Heidegger regarded Catholic dogma not as false, but rather as a dead letter, which used to be true in some sense, but which no longer signifies what it once did. The words may remain, but their meaning is gone, because modernity as a way of life is in performative contradiction with its inherited beliefs. Modern man may profess the Nicene Creed on Sunday, but he lives like an atheist during the week, as he offers an oblation to the gods of this world to reap its fruits. The destitution of modern society is that its gods are false and its worship is idolatry. It is not ordered to being, but to a multiplicity of things which do not deserve to be worshipped. It would be fair to say that what Heidegger meant by the return of art is the recovery of art's liturgical function to reveal the true nature of our existence and to orient our lives accordingly. An authentic life is lived ad orientem, looking toward an eschatological horizon and awaiting the sun that shall arise. Martin Heidegger died several years after the institution of the Novus Ordo Missae, the apocalyptic abrogation of the holy sacrifice of the Mass by Paul VI, and would never have regarded the traditional liturgy, much less the Catholic faith, as a solution to the destitution of modern society, given his own apostasy from the faith. But such is the implication of art's return, because art is essentially liturgical, and the liturgy is the supreme work of art. In pagan, no less than Christian societies, this was understood implicitly. In ancient Greece, not only was architectural magnificence largely reserved for religious buildings, but every art form from painting and sculpture to poetry and music was deployed first and foremost in a religious context. The Homeric epics were to the Greeks what the Pentateuch was to the Jews, while performances of the Oedipus trilogy by Sophocles and the Oresteia by Aeschylus were originally part of a religious festival, the Dionysia. Likewise, under Christendom, the greatest works of music, art, and architecture were made in the service of the Mass as the focal point of Christian civilization. While the beauty that surrounds the Mass is accidental to it, as a representation of our Lord's Passion, the holy sacrifice of the Mass is in a manner of speaking a performance of the most sublime tragedy which has graced the stage of history. To eyes of faith, the Mass is itself the most sublimely beautiful work of art, which illustrates the falsity of the Kantian reduction of the work of art to an aestheticized perceptual object. The merit of the Romantic ethic of authenticity in my own experience was this, that by determining not to lie to myself, but to be faithful to my own lights and inveterately suspicious of everything the culture takes for granted, I became aware of my true nature and purpose as a human being. By being true to myself, I became true to the nature which we all share in common. Man is made in the image of God, and so he finds his fulfillment in doing as God does. In Genesis, God creates in two steps, first by fiat out of nothing, saying, "Let there be light," and finally like a craftsman, by forming man from the dust of the earth. The first movement of creation is passive. It is as if God heard the cry of his as yet uncreated creatures and gave his fiat as if by assent to our desire. The second movement is active, the brooding of the Spirit over the waters. Man made in the image of God expresses his nature by doing the same. Man gives his fiat by assenting to God's will, as the priest does by reciting the Pater Noster in the canon of the Mass. And then man makes of the world what he will, completing the work of creation by cultivating the earth, building cities and establishing laws, composing poetry and painting paintings. Love God and do what thou wilt, as St. Augustine said. When man's actions are ordered to the good by the voluntary sacrifice of his will to God, he is empowered to set up a world of his own making. When man follows the laws of God, he is empowered to follow a law of his own invention as an artist. A Catholic is obliged to hear Mass on the first day of the week in honor of Christ's resurrection, so that one might reenact the first day of creation with him. We begin the week by giving our fiat as God gave his, and then we go to work just as God did, setting up a world by fashioning order out of chaos like the Spirit which hovered over the abyss. All of the work a Catholic does in the state of grace and with a supernatural intention, including making fine art, is an act of worship in which a man finds the fulfillment of his human nature. Even when art is aestheticized, depicting profane subjects such as classical mythology to adorn profane spaces, art still derives its vitality and purpose from the liturgy, as everything in the life of a Catholic is oriented by the Mass. There is no place for anything that is utterly profane in a Catholic culture, because the sacred subsumes everything. Whatever cannot be sanctified does not belong in the life of a Catholic. Aristotle said that man is the zoon politikon, the animal which of his nature departs from nature to dwell in the polis. St. Augustine might add that man is also called to depart from fallen nature to dwell in the city of God. In both the natural order and the order of grace, man expresses his nature by acquiring a second nature. In the natural order, this will consist of diverse skills and natural virtues. In the order of grace, it consists of the theological virtues. Man is what he does in the sense that his second nature is determined for good or for ill by whatever he does habitually. If man's nature is his essence, essentia deriving from the verb to be, esse, then his second nature is a habit, habitus deriving from the verb to have, habere. In the natural order, Habitus denotes a disposition acquired by habituation to exemplary practices, though this is not exactly true of the theological virtues being infused. Jacques Maritain explains in his book Art and Scholasticism, published in 1920, that habitus can denote either a moral or an intellectual virtue acquired through the creative transformation of rules into an internal rule which transcends them and so resists explicit enumeration, the clearest illustration of which would be the theological virtue of charity. As our Lord said, the whole of the law is contained in the commandment to love God and to love others as oneself. Charity is a supernatural habitus, which transforms the commandments into an internal rule which is irreducible. Following Aristotle's instruction to students of virtue, an aspiring artist is at first an impostor who memorizes the rules of a craft, copies what others have done, and continues to do so until the imposture becomes a habitus, as his babbling is transformed like an infant's learning to speak into a rich, articulate voice governed by its own inner logic. The explicit rules of art are like training wheels, which the artist only truly masters once they are gone. This is the germ of truth in Romanticism's antagonism to the rules of art. A virtuoso will act, as Maritain describes, not against the rules, but outside of and above them, in conformity with a higher rule and a more hidden order. Writing in 1920, Maritain was quick to make allowance for the de-skilling of modern art, which is only to be expected, since the defining thesis of his writing on integral humanism was that the Church should make peace with the modern world, as Paul VI in fact did at the Second Vatican Council under Maritain's influence. He should not have been so accommodating. It makes very little sense to speak of mastery in relation to art which exhibits no skill. The failure of academicism, as Maritain surmises, is not the failure of rules per se, but the decay of rules from a vital and spiritual state into clumsy and lifeless methods. The failure of academicism, if it should fail, is the decay of the craft from an intellectual virtue into mindless habits. Mastery is not reducible to mechanical rules. Mediocrity is sadly the rule and excellence the exception. Even the most talented artists have reason to be anxious about falling short of the mark. If to be is to care, then to be an artist is to care enough about one's craft to perfect it. It cannot suffice to be motivated by money or pride. Artists driven more by the ancillary rewards of fame and fortune will either sacrifice the ends of art in the pursuit or drive themselves mad with resentment. History is littered with the pathetic tales of men like the sculptor Pietro Torrigiano, who famously broke Michelangelo's nose in a fit of envy, or even John Singleton Copley, who despite his tremendous talent and unsurpassed diligence, became an unhappy, embittered failure by the end of his life for envy of Benjamin West. Life poses a question, according to Heidegger. Will you face the facts of existence and take up your role, however great or small that role may be, or will you absent yourself from the world and run away from your destiny? The temptation to flee is great, because life does not assign anyone a fate to be envied. Everyone is called to stand firm and die, like Leonidas at Thermopylae before the invincible forces of Xerxes. No one's story ends in marriage, not on this side of the grave, since everyone dies in the end. Earthly life is always a tragedy, and the greater one's destiny, the more terrible the tragedy, the greatest of which is to lose one's life for the greatest cause. A tragedy does not consist in the mere spectacle of suffering, which is only an object of horror and pity. On the terms of Romanticism, suffering is tragic only if it is borne willingly and in resistance against all that oppresses one. The tragic figure is not tempted into conformity. He does not yield to temptation, but defiantly crosses his arms in the name of the highest ideals against insurmountable odds. The tragic figure shows what it truly means to be human by willing the good no matter what the consequence may be, like Cordelia in Shakespeare's King Lear, for therein lies the perfection of every virtue. Insensible to such perfection, Herodotus did not think so highly of the Spartans, since he could not see past the recklessness of their fortitude. The martyr gives the lie to Aristotle's golden mean by proving that virtue lies in the most reckless excess of love, without which not one Christian would have consented to die at the hands of Diocletian, given the opportunity to apostatize. The highest good is a mark of which one may readily fall short but never exceed, it being infinite in magnitude. One simply cannot err by excess of charity. The error in Romanticism's tragic heroism is that a love worth dying for is taken up not by the self-determination of an autonomous subject making up his own ideals, but by being called out of oneself and into the fullness of being at the price of one's autonomy through an encounter with the good. This ecstasy is no mere sentiment, but a passion in accord with right reason and a willing which proceeds from truly knowing. He who knows what is, knows what he wills in the midst of what is. I am reminded of a painting by William Dyce, who was a member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, of the meeting of Jacob and Rachel, painted in 1850. It depicts the moment when Jacob knew what he willed in the midst of what is. What happens to an artist is of this kind. When Michelangelo was asked why he did not marry, he replied, "I have a wife too many already, namely this art, which harries me incessantly, and my works are my children." An aspiring artist recognizes the object of his desire in art and works tirelessly to earn it by mastering his craft. He secures his freedom only by surrendering his autonomy, as Jacob did by indenturing himself to Rachel's father. Whatever merit there is in the art and music and poetry of the Romantics, much of which one cannot help but hold in the highest degree of esteem, it is the beauty of the twilight. The Romantics basked in the glow of their inherited traditions, even as they worked to destroy them. Delacroix knew very well how to draw, and Turner was certainly not ignorant of his craft. Modern man would never have become a pioneering scientist like Antoine Lavoisier or an artistic genius such as Théodore Géricault, if not for the formative influence of earlier traditions. Not even Michelangelo would have taken up his place in the story of art had he not apprenticed himself to a master, because no painter is born a painter. The artist who would accomplish anything cannot cling to naive habits untested in the fire of historical precedent. Ignorant of what came before one's birth, as Cicero said, one remains forever a child. Jean-Jacques Rousseau may have found that a charming prospect, but an artist should know better than to romanticize childlike naivete or to prolong it beyond its natural duration. It is only by studying the best that has been done before, which is in fact what the Romantics did, that an artist can hope to realize his potential. Only in the 20th century were the destructive principles of Romanticism fully put into practice, as de-skilling completed the destruction of the craft tradition. Of course, Michelangelo was prompt to deny that he'd ever learned anything from Domenico Ghirlandaio, and Jacob was not very fond of Laban either, but such is the price of a great beauty. The anxiety of influence is the anxiety of every son-in-law toward his father-in-law. An aspiring artist should accept the rules of the craft as one would the teaching of the church without asking stupid questions. But why should art tell a story or imitate nature? Why should artists walk slavishly in the footsteps of the old masters? Why but for the obvious reason that a man cannot bear a child, for what is the craft but a bride and a mother? Every artist must master his craft, and the only way to acquire mastery is from another master. Whenever the craft has borne an illegitimate child, it has been the work of men who preferred to ravish painting by violence like Shechem, who forced himself on Jacob's daughter. An artist who has any respect for art or for himself has the dignity to earn the woman's hand. A real artist does the hard work and pays his dues, as Jacob did by laboring for 14 years, which was 7 more than he had intended. Although it takes a long time to master the craft, an artist who burns with sufficient desire is sustained by art's beauty. In truth, no man is her master, because it is she who masters him by inscribing a law on his heart. She gives him something to serve. To be a craftsman is to be a bridegroom. The bride price which an artist pays is not the price of ownership, because the craft is not a thing to be bought or sold, nor is it a slave to do with as one pleases. The craft tradition completes the hand that holds the brush by giving an artist a noble purpose and the means to accomplish it. It is a peculiarity of contemporary art education and a legacy of Romanticism that the means of making art have been abstracted from the end. Students are given tools, What they do with them is their own affair. The craft is considered a means to an indeterminate end, which artists are expected to make up according to what pleases them. This is not how the craft was practiced historically. Art had a final cause and a formal cause. Its object was beauty, and its form was the imitation of nature. The principles of Renaissance theory expressed the universal nature of art for all times and all places, a nature which is given unique expression by particular schools and styles, but not redefined by them. Practices opposed to beauty and the imitation of nature simply do violence to art by using it contrary to its nature. Art not only died in the 20th century, but was ravished and mutilated by modern and postmodern artists, who claimed that it was their prerogative to redefine what art is. By denying that art has any essential nature, modern and postmodern artists justified acts of violence against it, in exactly the same way that those who do violence to other people justify themselves by denying the humanity of their victims. Admittedly, violence against art is not quite so evil as violence against another human being, but it is a diabolical symbol of the violence of a society which lives in denial of human nature. Things have a nature which can be known and to which we must conform ourselves. By not only refusing to do so, but even celebrating sins against nature as if they were laudable, we are procuring our own misery and destruction. Confronting the destitution of the age, an artist is liable to doubt himself, as Moses did on being sent back down into Egypt and asked to free the people from their slavery, part the sea, climb the mountain, and reveal the mystery of being to a people who were ill-inclined to hear it. Only the most delirious idiot would have the hubris to imagine himself capable of so much. One does well to assume an attitude of self-deprecation. As Jacques Maritain observes, quoting first from Blaise Pascal and then from Jacques-Louis David, "True eloquence makes fun of eloquence. True morality makes fun of morality. To make fun of philosophy is to philosophize truly," to which the most tyrannical and the most radical of academy heads adds this savory gloss: "Unless you don't care a rap about painting, painting won't care a rap about you." If Catholics ever succeed in rebuilding Christendom, it will not be our own doing. An artist does not have to be the most talented, for the same reason that Moses did not have to be well-spoken, because no one has the innate ability to do what prophets do. While the discovery of something that others cannot see does have something to do with genius and hard work, it is also a question of vocation and of being attentive to one's calling. An artist simply cannot force the truth to show its face or compel a new world into existence. Like a burning bush, it has to be discovered unexpectedly. The world is veiled in darkness by man's hardened heart, impervious to being, as Heidegger described, but now and then something shines forth and speaks, calling one to set out on a journey. An artist should not be too quick to claim his vocation. Torrigiano should not have been envious of Michelangelo, because it is better not to be Moses. Great artists do what they do in spite of themselves, like Cassandra, unwilling victims of their ecstatic visions. Who wants to be a Laocoon, the priest of Apollo, who opposed bringing the Trojan horse into the city of Troy and was devoured along with his sons by giant serpents for his foresight? No one is rewarded for telling a truth that no one wants to hear. It is a mighty cavalier thing to get dressed up like a character of Charlton Heston's, climb a mountain, come down with a pair of tablets, shout down the masses, backsliding into slavery, and tell everyone what's what. It was a rough day when Moses went about smashing the golden calf and laying down the law. It is not without reason that the Levites acquired a reputation for violence. Moses was already an old man when God sent him back down into Egypt. Before he could come back, he had to grow up and leave. He had to be educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians before he could transcend that wisdom, and transcend it he did. There is a well-known correlation between the biblical story of Moses and the great epic poem of Middle Egyptian, The Tale of Sinuhe, though the significance of this correlation is in the difference between the two stories, which may serve to expose the falsehood in Romanticism's relativizing historicism. Without recounting the tale in its entirety, suffice it to say that Sinuhe, like Moses, is suspected of murder, or more precisely of regicide, flees to somewhere in the vicinity of Midian, performs various heroics, and finally at the end of his life is allowed to return to Egypt and be buried, not in an animal skin like the Bedouin, but in a wooden coffin. The meaning of the name Sinuhe is the son of the sycamore. In both Semitic and Egyptian traditions, the sycamore was a generic symbol of mother goddesses, especially Asherah and Hathor, who were also referred to as the tree of life, language not unrelated to the tree mentioned in Genesis. The goddess Isis was even represented in art as a literal tree suckling the king, a strange image one must admit, her milk the sustenance of eternal life. The implication of being buried in a wooden coffin was this very embrace of eternal life, a fact made explicit in the so-called Rishi coffins of the New Kingdom, which are covered in the feathery wings of the vulture Nekbet, the vulture being the hieroglyph for mother in Egyptian. The fact that Sinuhe is called the son of the sycamore gives away the ending. It is his destiny to be suckled by the sycamore, and so he is. Sinuhe is driven into exile by the fear of death. He runs away from Egypt, running from his own mortality, and he returns only when he realizes that he cannot escape. To be, in the tale of Sinuhe, is to be buried in a coffin in Egypt. This is salvation, because whoever is buried in a coffin in Egypt becomes like Osiris, the god of the dead. The mummified body of Osiris was understood to be the ground of all being, from which life springs and to which life returns. For the soul to ascend into heaven with the sun each day, the body of the deceased needed to be transformed into an Osiris, lest the ground of one's being be destroyed and one dissolve back into the watery abyss. The name of Moses is also significant. After he is retrieved from the Nile as an infant, the daughter of Pharaoh names him Moses because she drew him out of the water, in a providential anticipation of the sacrament of baptism. The logic of this statement seems to be based on homophony with the Hebrew word to draw, though one would expect the name to be Egyptian. The most likely Egyptian rendering of the name would be Msheh, written with the hieroglyph of an owl followed by a rectangular pool, which literally means from the lake. Another possibility is that the name comes from the root mes, which means to bear, to beget, or to create. This root occurs in the familiar names of Rameses, Ramosa, Emenmesi, Tuthmosis, and Ahmosa, all of which were common at the time, though they are also theophoric, meaning they include the name of a god. Since Moses is not theophoric, and Msheh is a better match for the Hebrew spelling of Moshe, Msheh is more likely. Regardless, Moses' name implies a clear allusion to Egyptian mythology, having to do with the daily rebirth of the sun. From beyond the horizon, the sun was believed to be reborn each morning from the watery abyss of Nun, from which the mound of creation sprang. Hence, for Moses to be drawn from the water was to be born again like the sun. Just as the sun was believed to be reborn every morning from the water, the sun was also said to die every evening in the water. Like Osiris, who drowned after being coaxed into a wooden coffin by his brother Seth and thrown into the Nile. Drowning was a holy death to the Egyptians, as a reenactment of the death of Osiris. To drown, as the Egyptian charioteers are said to have done in the Red Sea, was to reenact the setting of the sun on the western horizon. To emerge from the sea on the opposite bank, as the Hebrews did, was to reenact the rebirth of Khepri, the rising of the sun on the eastern horizon. Moses then ascended to heaven like Ra Horachti, the midday sun, by climbing a mountain, and with his face aflame like the sun, he came down with a new story of what it means to be, written in stone by the finger of God. It was not only by working miracles, but also by bearing the image of Ra, that Moses became like a god to the Egyptians. And the Lord said unto Moses, See, I have made thee a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron thy brother shall be thy prophet. The message was clear, that just as the Pharaoh claimed to be the son of Ra, Moses was a true son of God. The way that a man bears the divine image as a son of God must, is not by amassing power and enslaving other men like a Pharaoh, but rather by being born again like Moses through a baptism of repentance unto the remission of sins, and then keeping God's commandments, just like Moses, who literally carried them in his hands as Isaac had once carried the wood for the sacrifice, and as Christ would one day carry the cross. The 10 Commandments are a faithful representation of the tree of life. A fetishistic coffin is not. When our Lord was asked by a rich young man what he must do to gain eternal life, Jesus replied, "You know the commandments. To keep God's commandments, to do one's duty according to one's state in life, to perform the works of mercy, to mortify one's flesh, such is the cross that one must carry and the tree upon which one must die to live forever. Such is the second nature of supernatural charity by which man's first nature is perfected." In the last verse of the book of Genesis, we read that Joseph was laid in a coffin in Egypt. Yet Joseph's bones did not remain like sinews in the land of the dead on the west bank of the Nile, but were carried at his dying request out of Egypt and across the river Jordan into the land of the living, in an inversion of the burial of Sinuhe. The salvation which the Pharaoh Senwosret offered to Sinuhe, to be buried in a coffin in Egypt, was a lie. The ancient Egyptian coffin removed the anxiety of death, which is to lose what it means to be human, according to Heidegger. The cross, by contrast, teaches one how to be human by facing one's mortality in this valley of tears. Being toward death is a healthy fear of death, the anxiety that time will run out and so one must make the most of the present. It means being present by not fleeing the present through busyness or empty gratification. To be present is to live toward the future. Once while I was studying in Freiburg, a young woman asked me, "Bist du da, Benjamin? Are you there?" To which I replied rather nonplussed, "Natürlich, of course I am," not catching the implicit future tense. Bist du da is to ask not only are you there, but will you be there? The anxiety of Dasein is that one does not know the answer to this question. Will one's own story end in death or in marriage, a lake of fire, or the wedding supper of the Lamb? This uncertainty is what keeps the goal in view and motivates a Catholic to work out his salvation with fear and trembling. Being toward death entails leaving behind the comfort of home and its maternal embrace, like Sinuhe's flight from Egypt, in order to inhabit a new land and to surrender oneself to another. To win heaven and union with God, one must cleave to the cross and give one's assent to suffering and death. By returning instead to Egypt in the hope of saving his flesh through mummification, Sinuhe misses the point. He does not kill the Egyptian in himself, but tries to crawl back inside his mother's womb, the wrappings of a mummy being designed to resemble the swaddling of an infant. Alas, there is no succor in the wooden embrace of a coffin, let alone of serpents and scorpions disguised as mother goddesses. There was a grain of truth in ancient Egyptian religion. Egyptians believed that everyone would face a particular judgment, and they used the most insightful imagery to depict it, in the weighing of the heart against the feather of justice. Will we not be judged by the measure of our love? Even the smallest weight of charity suffices to balance the scale, because the feather of justice is light. And yet, in lieu of cooperating with God's grace, the Egyptians devised an alternative means of passing their particular judgment by way of witchcraft, which is why their tombs and coffins are covered in magic spells. Ancient Egyptian paganism promised a salvation it could not deliver, its partial truths being not only insufficient to lead souls to eternal life, but deadly. One single drop of poison suffices to turn the purest water into a suicidal cocktail, as St. John intimates when he speaks in the Apocalypse of a star called wormwood, which falls from heaven and embitters the life-giving waters of true doctrine. The most poisonous error of Romanticisms is its foundational doctrine of relativizing historicism, whereby every false religion and every disordered way of life have been construed as essentially good and meritorious, as they were by Paul VI in Nostra Aetate, an encomium to the purported merits of non-Christian religions, including Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Rabbinic Judaism. In fulfillment of St. John's prophecy, Catholic doctrine has been poisoned, and the truth which alone can set us free has been amended by false messiahs and false prophets, disguised as the successors of Peter. The tragic answer to the question which introduced Part 2 is that we who were once the nations of Christendom, the new Israel, and the chosen people are not sons and daughters of God or heirs of Christ's kingdom anymore, for we have orphaned ourselves in a repudiation of all that we were created to be. Artists, though the heirs of a noble lineage of Renaissance men and medieval saints, have become slaves in bondage to an anti-Christian culture which denies us our function.